Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our first Flyway Nights of this season. My name is Corky. I'm with Yolo Basin Foundation, and I'm really excited about tonight. Tonight, we're going to be learning, let's see. We are going to be hearing from Halie Goeman with River Partners, and I'm particularly excited because one of their projects takes place in our wildlife area. And I look forward to hearing more about what they're doing statewide, but also what they're doing specifically about the monarch butterflies right here in our own area. And also I want to make sure people know that next month, we're going to be hearing from the final fellowship recipients for our graduate students. And we're going to be hearing about mosquitoes, evaluating the Discover the Flyway program, pond turtle, and the giant garter snake, but there wasn't room on my screen to write all of that, and salmon. And pass over here to Halie so she can share with us all about the monarch butterflies. Welcome tonight.
Thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yep, we got you.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please bear with me. I hope my notes show up. If not, this might be a shorter presentation than we thought. So just give me a minute for my PowerPoint to appear. Okay, now let's start this. All right, can everyone see my screen?
That's perfect, thank you.
Perfect. So yeah, my name is Halie Goeman. I am a restoration biologist with River Partners. I just wanted to say thank you so much to Corky for having me come here and speak about our statewide experiment for the Western monarch. We partnered with the Xerces Society and Washington State University to create this amazing project. Just a quick brief about me. I've been working with monarch butterflies since 2017. I've helped raise monarchs, I've tagged them, I've done numerous surveys and biological assessments for not only the monarchs, but for their habitats. And I'm super excited to share the findings of our project. So let's go ahead and get into it. Just to give a little brief background about who River Partners is, it is a California-based nonprofit organization that aims to restore California's floodplains and riparian corridors to create wildlife habitat, not only for the benefit of people, but for the benefit of the environment. We were created in 1998 by two farmers. And since then, we have restored over 18,000 acres along 212 river miles. We've planted over 4 million native plants. We've developed technological advancements in plant propagation and field design. We've captured over 1 million tons of greenhouse gases, and we've conserved over 10 billion gallons of fresh water. We incorporate both agricultural practices and science-based research to implement our restoration projects. You can read more about us and get to know us a little more. You can even read our 2023 impact report, but our website will be linked down later towards this presentation. So this project was grant funded by the California Wildlife Conservation Board with a primary goal to restore approximately 600 acres of monarch breeding habitat and to enhance habitat connectivity across California by not only planting milkweed, but nectar-rich species on 8 sites across all of California, going from a north to south gradient. So I'll get into the specifics a little later of how we implemented this project, but first I think it would be pretty important to discuss the life cycle of monarchs, as our project really aimed to benefit almost all stages of the monarch. So I'm going to kind of start this a little backwards. Adult monarchs leave their overwintering sites in February and March, and typically reach their northern limit of their North American range in early to mid-June. adult females lay eggs on milkweed species, and the caterpillars rely upon those for energy and these protective toxins called cardinalides. And the milkweeds are crucial for the successful development of this caterpillar into an adult. So once that egg is laid, that full cycle of adulthood may last anywhere from 20 to 35 days. The caterpillars develop through 5 instars, which is just a fancier way of saying the caterpillar's 5 growth stages before forming into that beautiful green chrysalis and then eventually pupating into an adult butterfly. So during the spring and the summer, an adult monarch spends about 2 to 5 weeks of its lifespan mating and nectaring on flowers, with the females searching for milkweed to lay their eggs. Multiple generations are produced during this time, with the final fall generation migrating to their overwintering sites, and then they live between 6 to 9 months. So if you can see here that this is the little Monarch highway, and the one on the left shows their migration down south, and the image on the right shows their migration up north. The annual migration of monarch butterfly is pretty unique in that it is the only butterfly species that we know of that makes a 2-way migration like birds do. So unlike other butterflies that can overwinter as larvae or pupae or even adults, in some species, monarchs cannot survive the cold winter climates of up north. So they use environmental cues, and that's how they know when it's time to travel south for the winter. Monarchs use a combination of air currents and thermals to travel along a huge amount of distance. Monarchs living west of the Rocky Mountain Range in North America is called the Western monarch population. They overwinter along the Pacific coast near Santa Cruz and San Diego. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the huge flocks of monarchs that are in Pacific Grove every year. It's really just a beautiful thing to see. The eastern population of monarchs overwinter in Mexico. The California coast has a microclimate that's pretty similar to central Mexico. The monarchs will roost in those big eucalyptus and Monterey pines and the cypresses. And as the temperatures warm and the days become longer, that migratory generation of monarchs finishes the development that they halted prior to their migration. They become reproductive, they breed, and they lay the eggs of the new generation. And then this starts the northern journey. Unlike the generation before them who made the 1 generation journey south, the successful generations now make their journey north. Unfortunately, the Western monarchs population has declined by approximately 99.9% in the past 4 decades. In the past, we used to see millions of monarchs that would flock to the overwintering sites. However, just in 2020, only 2,000 monarchs were counted during the Thanksgiving count. Their overwintering habitat is the most vulnerable to urban development and not agricultural conversion. However, their breeding habitat is the result, or the decline in their breeding habitat is the result of agricultural conversion. With the conversion, it brings use of pesticides and herbicides that threaten the monarchs. Warmer temperatures impacts their migratory cycle. And because of that, that changes the microclimates of their traditional overwintering sites. We've seen both dramatic drought years, we've seen dramatic wet years, and that can really cause disruptions in their entire life cycle. There are diseases and parasites such as the protozoan parasite called OE for short, because there's no way that I can pronounce the actual name of it. And that parasite can cause deformities in monarchs. And lastly, predation is also a known threat to these declining monarch populations. When there's less places to hide, it's easier for predators to find you and to eat you. So with what we know now about the declining population trends amongst monarchs, River Partners and our partners wanted to design a really cool project that would not only restore the monarch breeding habitat across the state, but we also wanted to learn more about their behavior. We aimed for a project that could be one, easily repeatable, not just for us, but for other organizations and for researchers. We were interested in learning more about monarch egg deposition preferences regarding pollinator plant plot size, the absence or presence of a vertical structure for shade, distance to water. This project also aimed to provide floral resources for not only monarchs, but for other pollinators too. And we wanted, early spring to late fall differences in plants to increase the diversity and abundance of pollinators within each site. So we began this project in 2020 with the first site being planted in June of that year, and then the last site was planted in November of 2021. You can see here some very beautiful narrowleaf milkweed. Part of the practice of River Partners is we plant potted stock with old milk cartons with a stake. These are biodegradable, and it helps protect the plant against pests or rodents, and ensures that they will have the best chance of survival. Please let me know if I am going too fast. I can always slow down a little bit. So first, we needed to look at the habitat requirements for monarchs and pollinators. We know that monarchs use milkweed as their host plant for part of their life cycle. The problem is there's roughly 15 species of milkweed that are native to California. And some of that milkweed seed is pretty difficult to source because the locations of these species are pretty limited. We have areas of milkweed that we just don't know where they are. And next, we need nectar sources. When monarchs leave their overwintering sites, they're going to need a lot of fuel for their journey. Imagine that they're pretty hungry. So while milkweed is a monarch's host plant for egg laying and for the caterpillars, they also need those nectar-rich plants that will flower at different parts of the year to get that fuel. So for example, you can see this really beautiful arroyo lupin and some gold fields pictured. This was at our Yolo bypass site. And these are great examples of early flowering nectar plants. They pop up in the spring, and then we have to the right some gum plant, and those are more late bloomers in like August and fall. Some other really important late nectar plants is mugwort, western goldenrod, and gum plant. So then we also have to look at the surrounding area. Areas surrounding monarch habitat can influence the monarch's use and survival at the site. Land use changes have caused natural areas to become smaller and more fragmented. Surrounding habitat covered by natural vegetation is much more beneficial to monarchs than surrounding land that's been altered. This is because the natural vegetation surrounding wildlife habitat reduces the risk of injury or death by vehicles or human activity, such as the use of pesticides and herbicides. Additionally, breeding habitats in close proximity allow monarchs to find suitable habitat without having to travel super long distances in between. Then lastly, we got to consider land management. Environmentally friendly management practices are super important for successful monarch conservation. Land activities that can help reduce the effects of habitat disruption include eliminating, once again, the use of pesticides and herbicides, but you can also use prescribed burning and mowing, collecting that native seed, and then planting more of those native species. And what's really, really important as well is trying to control invasive species. Monarchs have evolved with California's native plant diversity, so it's just really crucial to have those in their habitat rather than non-native species. And that's not to say that non-native species are entirely bad, because they do have nectar that fuels these pollinators. But it's really not ideal if you want to have great habitat selection. As these non-natives, they tend to outcompete our native species by consuming most of the water in the upper parts of the soil profile. And it basically suffocates our native plants who evolved for drought. And so by that, they develop really deep root systems into the water table so that they can survive periods of drought and just for long-term survival. So because of the variety of our sites statewide, excuse me, we broke them down into 3 types, and they're color-coded on this map. I apologize if it's a little hard to see, but we have type 1 sites. They incorporate milkweed into an already existing restoration site. These include the Oroville Wildlife Area in Oroville, Dos Rios Ranch. That is a River Partners property in Modesto that is actually scheduled to be California's newest state park here pretty soon. We have the North Grasslands Wildlife Area near Merced, Panorama Vista Preserve near Bakersfield, and Hollenbeck Canyon Wildlife Area near San Diego. These sites are irrigated either through a drip line or through flood irrigation. And then we have type 2 sites, which are California Department of Fish and Wildlife property with flood irrigation. We just have one site that has this type, and that is actually the Yolo bypass here by Sacramento. And then we have our type 3 sites. These are also California Department of Fish and Wildlife property without any irrigation. So this includes the Upper Butte Basin Wildlife Area near Gridley and the Feather River Wildlife Area near Yuba City. And so for those sites that are not already a part of an existing restoration project, our plot-based experimental design was implemented. The treatment is as follows. There are 2 plot sizes. We have large plots and small plots. The large plots are 100 meters square, and the smaller plots are 50 meters by 10 meters. The conditions which were based on available site conditions include distance from water, either near or far, the presence or absence of vertical structures for shade. We planted milkweed at a density of 2,989 plants per hectare. We use plugs at sites with irrigation. So for type 1 and type 2, which you can see on the right is a milkweed plug. It has, the soil and the little bit of the root to it. And then we have rhizomes, which is just a fancier way of saying a big root. These were used at sites that had inconsistent or no type of irrigation. So a type 3 type site. Our salt slough project on the North Grasslands Wildlife Area, milkweed and other pollinator forbs were actually broadcast seeded. So for our seed mix, it was entirely dependent on site location. That made sense geographically. We wanted plants with different flowering phenology that either blooms early spring to late fall. Like I mentioned earlier, that is really important for all the different stages of the monarch life cycle. And so you can also see on the left, these are showy milkweed rhizomes. They almost look like little, roots you would find at the grocery store. So this is an example of a type 3 site with an experimental plot-based design. This is the Abbott Lake unit of the Feather River Wildlife Area by Yuba City. So we have 2 large plots and 10 small plots. The large plots are the ones shown as squares. The colors of the plots represent if it's near a vertical structure or not. I'm not quite sure which one is which in this image. I apologize for that. These large plots have a distance of 250 meters from each other, and then the smaller plots are 50 meters apart. The larger plots also received 2,989 milkweed rhizomes each, while the smaller plots received 150 milkweed rhizomes each. We decided in this particular site that distance to water was not going to be included as a factor. So the graph on the right represents the flowering species that we use statewide. might be a little hard to read. I apologize for that. But the pollinator seed mix and the milkweed species varied by location. The types of milkweed plantings varied by location as well. We broadcast seeded, we planted plugs, and we planted the rhizomes like I explained earlier. We aimed to use only the correct ecotypes on each site. So what that means is the seed and the plants we used are better suited genetically to the regional growing conditions and to help preserve the genetic diversity of the native species. So we don't really want to plant something that flourishes here north down south. You know, it's just gonna, if we wanted to take something that is, you know, flourishes up here at the Yolo bypass, we don't want to put that down anywhere in San Diego. And like I said, we also aim to have at least one species that blooms from February to October at each of these sites to provide nectar during their migration and other pollinators with floral resources as well. This list does not include species planted in type 1 sites because type 1 sites are already established restoration areas. So for example, the Oroville Wildlife Area's planting palette includes wild rose and elderberry, golden currant, and mulefat. At our Hollenbeck Canyon Wildlife Area project, the restoration plantings include lemonade berry, bush mallow, California buckwheat, California fuchsia, sage, and penstemon. These seeds and the milkweed would be planted next to these plantings, either as companion plants or along the berms. So we didn't have a very typical way of doing this. So how did we monitor these sites? So for monitoring, we used a couple of different methods. The Xerces Society conducted visits 3 times per year from May to September at each of our sites for both monarch and pollinator sampling. River Partners monitored the milkweed and other plant species by using 2 different methods of sampling. So for our plot-based design sites, we used what's called the releve method that was developed by the California Native Plant Society. I'll get into that in just a minute. And a full census at our non-plot-based design sites. So monarch sampling was conducted by searching all of the stems of the milkweed for monarchs. You record the number of eggs and caterpillars you find by each instar, so at each of their growth rates, as well as the number of stems searched for each milkweed species by vegetative, fruiting, and flowering stems. If we had more than 500 stems, the milkweed was sampled along 6 25-meter transects. So this, for example, was done at our Dos Rios and Panorama Vista Preserve. So to kind of visualize that a little better, we have our rows of our plants, and then we pick a spot where the milkweed starts. We take our transect tape and we go down 25 meters, and then we go through and sample every single stem. We have to look for all the different types of life cycles that a monarch could possibly be on. The pollinator sampling was done based on the Xerces Society streamlined bee monitoring protocol. So a set of 100 feet transects were established roughly 250 feet apart. So then you walk each of those transects for 7.5 minutes, so totaling 15 minutes between both transects. And you basically just observe all of the pollinators that are visiting flowers, and you record the species in bloom, and you obviously identify the type of pollinator that you have and the floral abundance along each transect. And so for each of these sites, there was about 3 or 4 transect pairs that we did. All pollinators were identified to a group. So we have honeybees and bumblebees, carpenter bees, tiny dark bees, butterflies, flies, moths, and yes, even wasps. I know a lot of people don't like wasps, but yes, they are actually pollinators as well. So kind of circling back into our census, at our plot-based design sites, we used releves. So what we would do is we would start by generating a random point on ArcGIS, but we wanted to make sure that these are actually representative of what is found on site. So we don't want to make a point that's like way off from our pollinator plot. So with our transect tape, we start at the point in the southwest corner, we walk north, and then we move east, and then we come back south, creating this square so you can assess vegetation cover and composition data. The size and the number of these releve plots were determined by the size of the pollinator plot. So what that means, in these larger plots, we have more releves. In the smaller ones, we have less releves. Within the releve method, we collected other types of data too, such as average height of shrubs and forbs and trees, plant species. We collected data on soil, if there's any disturbances, like if there was a fire or if there is a heavy load of non-natives, bioturbation, which is just a way of saying, are any animals using this particular plot? And the site history, like, has this site burned before? And so with our non-plot based designs, we used a census, which just means that we noted if the milkweed was alive or dead. And this picture is actually releve that I was doing in the field. I can't remember what specific site it was at, but they're actually really fun to do out in the field. So I'm going to start with each of our sites, starting with Upper Butte Basin Wildlife Area. This was actually planned to be a type 2 site with flood irrigation, but unfortunately, there was no way to install any water structures here. So this actually became a type 3 site. So we would have no irrigation here. We had pollinator plots in 3 fields. So in that left corner is the Llano Seco. And then we have the Howard Slough unit. And within those, there are 2 fields. There is North Howard, and then there is South Howard. This site was installed as a plot-based design. So we had 18 small plots and 2 large plots in this previously restored grassland. So within this site, we decided to have proximity to water as a factor that we would measure. The Llano Seco unit had 5 plots near a canal and 5 plots far from the canal. The North Howard, or excuse me, the South Howard field had only 1 plot close to a canal and then 1 plot far from the canal. And the North Howard just didn't have any of that. It was just all in the sun. So this all started in November 2021. We planted 8,678 showy milkweed rhizomes, all planted within the 20 plots. The plots were also broadcast seeded with the pollinator forb mix in the following month, so December 2021. And then we drill seeded native grasses in January 2022. Unfortunately, here, the showy milkweed did not establish. We hypothesized that this is from a lack of rain and no irrigation and a continued weed presence here. So we replanted these plots back to 100% the following November, but this time we instead used narrowleaf milkweed plugs because a couple of our biologists discovered a remnant patch nearby on site. So to prepare for this, we disked the fields for replanting, and then we went ahead and planted everything. But however, as everyone might remember, 2022 and 2023 was a record-breaking wet year. So the fields here were flooded and they did not dry out until May of 2023. So nothing really survived here. So we had extra available seed that we broadcast seeded again in October of this year. So This project has come to a close already, but now with a new season of rain hitting in, we think that this area will increase in native forb cover again in the future. So to kind of go into the specifics of what happened here, and this site had very low species cover in general, about 6% total, and only 1% of that being native cover. The poor establishment of our seed mix and general low cover is just likely due to the lack of irrigation in 2021 and 2022. Those were both drought years, and then 2023 was a prolonged inundation period. So our percent cover was too low to determine the impact of the proximity to water. Milkweed was not found in our planted plots, unfortunately, but there were still 2 of those natural patches that were found on site. When Xerces Society went out and sampled, they totaled about 153 stems. And then they also decided that there was low floral abundance at this time. After replanting in 2022, and then we improved weed control and a wet winter in spring of 2023, native cover increased greatly. So with that, we had 34% with the Xerces Society noting really high floral abundance. However, as the fields were flooded January through May, the milkweed decreased since 2022. While several dozen milkweed were observed in August of this year, they were only found in the large plot farthest from the canal, which was inundated the shortest length of time. The Xerces Society has noted that this particular site has a really big potential for it being high quality pollinator habitat in the future. We just kind of need a break in a drought and super wet years to kind of establish everything for things to really grasp. So then we have the Oroville Wildlife Area. This is a type 1 site that had drip irrigation and continued weed maintenance, but this was a not standard plot-based design. We planted the milkweed as companion plants amongst our already potted stock as for a restoration site. In June 2020, 982 narrow leaf milkweed plugs were planted among the previously planted stock and cuttings, which included a very nectar-rich species diversity. In February 2021, 480 additional showy milkweed rhizomes were planted at the site in a pseudo plot formation. 12 plots were planted with 4 treatments. And with those 4 treatments, it's either on irrigation in the full sun, on irrigation and in the shade, off irrigation in the shade, and then on irrigation with no shade, or off irrigation with no shade. The 240 plants on irrigation milkweed were planted as companion plants in the new locations along the planted rows, while the 240 off irrigation milkweed were just planted nearby. In December 2021, dead milkweed was replanted and seed mix was seeded in the row centers across 18 acres. This site was monitored using a full census, so we did not record the percent cover. Though through the Xerces Society sampling, they found a generally low floral abundance at the site in 2022. And then it's highly variable from low abundance to medium high abundance in 2023. We found 1,439 milkweed stems in 2022, showing a super high abundance. However, this year we only found 92. And that mortality is likely due to the lack of irrigation this year, but then also 2 of these fields could not be accessed due to flooding from this past winter. The Xerces Society sampling showed that the majority of the floral resources on site were from our nectar-rich seed mix, and they believe that this site will continue to support monarchs and pollinators as these plants become more established and grow deep into the soil profile. Next, we have our Feather River Wildlife Area. This was a type 3 site with a plot-based design. There was no site preparation and no maintenance planned for this site. It was basically just plant and then we just hit the road. And additionally, no seed mix was applied here either. So we started this in February 2021 with 7,478 showy milkweed rhizomes in 10 small plots in field 3, and then 2 large plots in field 1 and 2. Field 1 was entirely in the sun and field 2 was in the shade in this previously restored grassland. So we are using the sunshade effect here. Unfortunately, the trees that were shading our milkweed in field 3 burned in the spring after planting. So due to this, our ability to determine if shade effects was causing any differences was quickly diminished. On average, this site had 9% native cover, likely due to the lack of irrigation and drought conditions impacting establishment, as well as a pretty high weed competition. Native cover was low to determine an impact of the sunshade factor, and unfortunately, no milkweed was observed by either River Partners or the Xerces Society. However, the Xerces Society did find a high floral abundance at this site, but primarily due to non-native short pod mustard and yellow star thistle, which is my least favorite plant, fun fact. And then, then we have the Yolo bypass. This was a type 2 site with flood irrigation and was a plot-based design. This site was intended to be naturally flooded when the bypass receives water and not manually giving any water. This site had pollinator plots in 2 different fields called Glide 10 and Greens Lake. In March 2021, we planted the showy milkweed rhizomes in 10 small plots at Glide 10, and then in 1 large plot at Greens Lake. Glide 10, we used the proximity to water factor in the design. And so we had 5 plots close to the water or close to wet swales, and then 5 not near the wet swales. Native grasses were seeded around these plots. And then in March 2021, a forb seed mix was drill seeded within the plots. The bypass did get a pulse flood irrigation that occurred right after our plantings to initiate the rhizome sprouting. However, 2021 and 2022 were dry years with little rain, and the bypass did not flood again. So the plants received little to no water. So what we did is the following year in November 2022, all of these plots were replanted back to 100%. And we put the showy milkweed plants in deep tree bands, and we broadcast seeded to 100% with that same seed mix. Additionally, in Glide 10, 2,000 potted stock of pollinator plants were planted in raised berms near the plots, totaling a little over 2.5 acres. So less than 2 months after planting, the Yolo bypass flooded from January to March, and then sporadically again throughout the summer. So this resulted in pretty low establishment of our replanted milkweed and seed mix. This site had low cover in general, with higher native cover in Greens Lake compared to Glide 10. Cover was too low in Glide 10 to determine impact of proximity to water. And Xerces Society found pretty low floral abundance at this site, with no milkweed observed. The poor establishment of the milkweed and seed mix is likely due to the alternating of drought and then flooding. Despite being reseeded and replanted in November, cover did not increase again in 2023. The Xerces Society found low floral abundance this year, and they once again, did not find any milkweed either last year or this year. When I was actually out at the Yolo bypass, I did observe some milkweed, but they were not anywhere near our plants or near our plots. They were more on like raised berms, so they might have gotten out of the flooding or were more established by the time it started to flood. At our Dos Rios Ranch, this was a type 1 site with ongoing irrigation, and we had a plot-based design. In May of 2021, narrow leaf milkweed plugs were planted in 4 large plots. And we used the sunshade effect as a variable within this design. 2 of the plots planted in the shade and 2 of them in the sun. The milkweed plugs were planted on berms in between our already planted potted stock, which received flood irrigation. These potted stalks contained nectar-rich plants and nectar-rich forb seed mix that was applied in 2021, in May of 2021, excuse me. In July of that year, 2,000 additional milkweed was planted to replace what had died, as well as to expand the plots. Therefore, the final size of our plots were actually much bigger than we had planned. In 2023, all of these plots were once again flooded from January to July, but this site saw a great establishment of the seed mix with a 30% average native cover, largely due to mugwort, gum plant, and evening primrose. 9,036 milkweed stems were counted, and milkweed was found in all of our plots, with the highest cover being in shaded areas. Other species cover was not impacted by the sun or shade. The Xerces Society found high floral abundance, while weed cover was kept at a low at this site. So unfortunately, this year we only counted 1,210 milkweed stems, a decrease from the year before, but that is likely due to the 7 months that this site was flooded. Average native cover also decreased to 9%, and floral abundance ranked low to medium, but that is also, once again, due to a 7-month inundation period. Wild cover sampling occurred after the site had already dried, excuse me. It's possible that the understory just did not have enough time to establish. At our North Grasslands wildlife area, this was a type 1 site with ongoing irrigation in a plot-based design, as milkweed was only able to be seeded in strips in conjunction with a grassland seed project that was developed by Ducks Unlimited. Pollinator rows were seeded in December of 2020. Narrow leaf milkweed was seeded, as well as a seed mix with nectar-rich forbs. The site was irrigated with flood irrigation. Shade and proximity to water were not variables that we decided to include in this design. At this site, there were 2 different sites broken up in, well, at this site, we had 2 different fields. In December 2022, 6 of the 24 acres were reseeded using that same mix as previous, but we had a lower percentage of milkweed. So this site saw great establishment of that seed mix, but unfortunately low milkweed establishment. On average, there was about 24% native cover, primarily composed of gum plant, mugwort, yarrow, and telegraph weed. Milkweed was only found in 2 subplots in the northern fields, with a total of 19 stems. The Xerces Society found that there was a high floral abundance at this site in 2022 and was about medium to high in 2023. While the milkweed stems were not counted in 2023, there was still milkweed observed. At our Panorama Vista Preserve, this is a type 1 site with ongoing irrigation installed as a plot-based design. In April 2021, 3,600 narrowleaf milkweed and desert milkweed species, or plugs, excuse me, were planted in 4 small plots and in 1 large plot. And these were put in areas that already had potted stock because this is a type 1 site. This is an already established restoration site. And these plants are receiving drip irrigation. Within this site, we wanted to use proximity to water as a variable. The large plot was closer to the river, and then this small plot was not close to the river. In December 2021, nectar-rich Forbes seed mix was seeded, as well as 60 silver lupins across the entire acreage of the 5 plots. Excuse me. Along the same drip line as there is milkweeds, excuse me. Unfortunately, this site did not have good establishment of that seed mix, but due to plantings that we had, we still had a medium native cover on average in both 2022 and 2023. However, this site did have the highest species richness. 2,890 milkweed stems were counted in 2022, and only 653 were counted in 2023. The decrease is partially due to the lower sampling effort that occurred here, but also with the continued drought conditions. And then finally, at the Hollenbeck Canyon Wildlife Area, this was a type 1 site with ongoing irrigation, but was not installed as a plot-based design. In April 2021, 776 narrow-leaf milkweed plugs were planted into 4 small plots, but at a lower density than the other sites. So they were planted in groups of 3, but that was only when a plant from the original restoration design had died. So this resulted in a maximum of 90 individuals per plot. We use the sunshade factor within this. So we had 1 plot that was in the shade and the other 3 were in the sun. No Forbes seed mix was applied a part of this site, but since this is an already established restoration site, there were nectar plants that were there that provide a pretty good source of nectar. So September 2022, River Partners received a little nice donation of milkweed, and we use these to replace any dead individuals. This site was not assessed for percent cover, but had a pretty good establishment of milkweed. The Xerces Society found that the site had a pretty high floral abundance in 2022, and then a medium abundance in 2023. The sampling showed 30% of an average cover of native nectar-rich species, though only a small percentage of it was milkweed. We counted 467 milkweed stems in 2022, and that decreased to 375 in 2023. So these are the results taken from the Xerces Society from their annual pollinator report. Over the course of this project, 6 of the 8 sites, all but the Yolo bypass and the North Grasslands Wildlife Area, were visited by monarchs. In 2021, 3 monarch larvae were observed at Hollenbeck Canyon Wildlife Area. In 2022, all eggs and larvae and adults were observed across 4 of our sites, which includes the Oroville Wildlife Area, Upper Butte Basin Wildlife Area, our Dos Rios Ranch, and Panorama Vista Preserve, totaling 65 individuals. Only 4 adults were observed in 2023 at 4 sites, but we did observe 1 ovipositing at our Upper Butte Wildlife Area. Additionally, in 2023, Cheryl Schultz with the Washington State University went out to the Oroville Wildlife Area, Dos Rios Ranch, and our Panorama Vista Preserve, and she did find some larvae at these sites. Based on the presence of eggs or larvae, I'd say that we were pretty successful at documenting monarch breeding at 4 of our sites. And these sites also had successful milkweed establishment. While our North Grasslands Wildlife Area and Upper Butte Wildlife Area didn't have eggs or larvae, there is presence of milkweed there that can likely support monarch breeding in the future, and probably already supports migratory monarchs. And we can say this because at the Upper Butte Wildlife Area, an adult was observed ovipositing there. The nectar of the other species found at the Yolo bypass in the Feather River Wildlife Area may still support monarchs. And we had an adult that was observed at the Feather River Wildlife Area on a yellow star thistle in 2023. The number of immature monarchs per stem of milkweed sampled is a pretty useful metric of monarch use of the habitat. As floral resources on our project sites become more established and more breeding is observed, this metric can be used to compare monarch usage across a whole range of restoration sites and or natural areas, and potentially as a metric of restoration progress. So it might seem that the monarch data is pretty low, but there are still some, it's still notable when considering the limitations of monarch surveys. Tracking individual monarchs is pretty difficult to learn about butterfly demographics. Even if the habitat is ideal at a restoration site, the nature of monarchs make it hard to, measure their behavioral responses to the site. And additionally, the sampling effort for the project was not super intensive. Sites were only visited 3 times per year, and more observations would be expected if the effort was more intensive. Overall, River Partners, I think, created successful monarch breeding and migratory habitat across the entire state. Overall, the pollinator sampling has shown that the project resulted in the creation of usable habitat by tons of pollinator species across the state. Pollinator abundance and richness increased at many of our sites over the past 3 years as these plants become more established. As expected, pollinator abundance and richness was highest at sites with abundant floral resources, which is influenced by factors such as, the age of the restoration planting, drought, access to water, prolonged periods of inundation. Floral abundance was tied to, lost where I was at. Floral abundance also higher at more mature restoration sites with shrubs, actually. A total of 1,279 pollinators were observed, the pollinator transects at all 8 sites in 2023, which is higher than previously recorded in 2021 and 2022. Hollenbeck Canyon Wildlife Area, North Grasslands Wildlife Area, Dos Rios Ranch, and the Feather River Wildlife Area had pretty high pollinator abundance due to a higher floral abundance. Notably, Feather River Wildlife Area floral abundance was largely composed of non-natives, and of non-native plants and non-native honeybees. Yolo bypass in the Panorama Vista Preserve had pretty low pollinator abundance due to the lower floral abundance. Upper Butte Basin Wildlife Area and Oroville Wildlife Area both saw the most marked increase in pollinator abundance over time, and this correlates to the increase of floral abundances. In 2023, which is the final year of our project, a highest abundance of pollinators was observed at our Dos Rios Ranch project and our North Grasslands Wildlife Area. Due to an unusually high number of pollinating flies. Not quite sure why, honestly. Honeybees and striped sweat bees and tiny dark bees were the next most common pollinators observed. All of these sites varied in the total number of observed pollinator groups, over the course of this project. The southernmost sites had the highest number of groups in 2021, and most sites experienced a decrease in 2022. A total of 31 butterfly species were observed across all of the sites, with the highest richness at the Hollenbeck Canyon Wildlife Area down by San Diego, with 15 species observed. And then 5 of the 8 sites had over 11 species observed. It's important to note that 21 of these species that were identified are actually declining or listed as imperiled species following recent studies. Additionally, few bumblebees were found on our project sites. In 2021, we only saw 1 bumblebee, and 2022, only 2 were seen sampling at the Upper Butte Basin Wildlife Area. And in 2023, no bumblebees were found, which is kind of sad to hear. This project had several challenges during both design and implementation. Our first challenge was, where the heck are we getting our plant material from? Where are we sourcing our seeds? Particularly showy milkweed rhizomes. Those are pretty hard to find. They take a long time to produce, and they're not always readily available at nurseries. The pollinator seed mix, we wanted to provide each site with the wide flowering range, whose seed is also readily available with the correct ecotype. We specifically had trouble sourcing the correct ecotypes of elegant Clarkia and California poppies at our Panorama Vista Preserve. So up here you can see the showy milkweed seed pod, and then the right is actually what the showy milkweed looks like. It is a gorgeous plant. So despite those challenges, we also had a lot of success. We have a variety of pollinators that visit our projects. We have lots of bees and butterflies, wasps and flies. And we did see our yellow-faced bumblebee friend at the Oroville Wildlife Area and at Dos Rios. But I wanted to really exclaim that we don't just try to provide habitat for monarchs, but we want to incorporate all wildlife. River Partners does not do single species restorations. All of our projects are intended to increase habitat for an abundance of wildlife. At our Hollenbeck Canyon project, we had a least Bell's vireo nesting on our site. This is an endangered subspecies of the Bell's vireo down in Southern California. We also have rattlesnakes. We try to, we want to make habitat not only for, listed species, but for all wildlife. All wildlife depend on different habitats, because, habitats nowadays are becoming a lot more fragmented and being converted into agriculture or urban development. All wildlife is losing critical habitat that they need. So River Partners really tries to create projects that will benefit not only listed species, but, all types of wildlife. The largest takeaway from this project for management recommendations is the importance of the right amount of water to establish milkweeds. The first 2 years of this project were drought years, with limited precipitation available for the establishment of our milkweeds. With the project areas that received little to no supplemental irrigation in those first 2 years, there was poor milkweed establishment. Projects with regular irrigation, either from the drip irrigation or from flood irrigation, we saw a better establishment of milkweeds. However, on the flip side, we had a particularly wet winter. Periods of prolonged inundation was detrimental to milkweed establishment. So for example, the Yolo bypass, there was too long of a period of inundation too soon after we planted our milkweed. So they didn't really get a great chance to establish. However, at our Dos Rios ranch, we did have milkweed that was a little more established And even though that site was also flooded for a long time, we did not see a really big decline in the milkweed because that milkweed had a lot of time to grow its roots all the way down within the soil profile. Another recommendation is the necessity of regular weed control while establishing native plants. So while pollinators do use non-native species for nectar, we know that these pollinators have evolved with California's native plants, and we see increases in abundance of pollinators when there's a higher native floral abundance. As far as the sun shade factor, this wasn't replicated enough to really give the best recommendations. What we noticed that there was a trend in milkweed, they established better in the shade, but however, too few monarchs were observed to really suggest if they prefer milkweed in the sun or in the shade. To really test that, I think we need to have some more formal experiments to really address those type of questions. So what next? What else can we do? With this Monarch project coming to a close, we've had a few lessons learned. This project was intended to create an experimental canvas that would help future experiments and projects better understand the potential effectiveness of restoration for monarchs. Many of our projects are within the light blue and dark blue areas of this map. And these will be areas that will be prioritized for any of our future projects. Additionally, future testable questions could be presented for future research, including how important is it to include nectar for monarchs close to breeding habitat, as well as nectar throughout the breeding season in the Central Valley, or milkweed density, and the importance for monarch behavior and performance. Additionally, even with milkweed species diversity, at one of our sites, we had 2 different species of milkweed there. We would like to know, maybe in the future, do monarchs prefer one species over the next in a different geographic area? To address the issue of seed sourcing, River Partners created its own native seed farm to close that bottleneck of limited seed availability for restoration projects. And it's called Heritage Growers. We work pretty close with Heritage Growers for native seed and plugs of high quality and genetic integrity to put into our restoration sites, and they make it easier for all of our future projects. So then what can you do? Planting milkweed and pollinator plants native to your region is highly beneficial by creating a habitat with nectar-rich species with different flowering times, and planting milkweed can help give monarchs a better chance for their survival. The best place to get these species are from a local nursery. So while places like Green Acres and Lowe's and Home Depot have seeds, they don't always have the best seed for your area, because it's really important to know the seed that you're buying is local to your area. And usually the nurseries will have good genetic integrity aligned with them. You can join the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper Project. You go ahead and upload photos of monarchs and milkweed. You can upload your photos to iNaturalist. They have a project about monarchs where you can take pictures of milkweed so they can find better places to scout for seed. And then you can join the Thanksgiving count. You can sign up and then get trained up and submit your data. And the best part is you get to go and look at butterflies all day. I've done it before. It's a lot of fun. With that, I wanted to just give a big thank you to all of our partners and our funders who, without their support, this project would not be possible. If you are interested in more information about this project, you can visit our website, riverpartners.org. If you are interested in learning about Heritage Growers, I've also put their website, heritagegrowers.com. And if you have any questions and you don't want to ask them right now, feel free to shoot me an email. My email is also down below. I also just wanted to give a huge thank you again to Corky and her team for hosting me tonight to present this, and all of my colleagues who put in hours of data collection in the hot, hot sun. It was not easy work, but it was really rewarding. So with that, I'll be answering any questions. I know that was a ton of information with a lot of numbers that I spit out, but I would be happy to address any questions that you have to the best of my ability. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Corky. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm of course kind of bummed that our own wildlife area wasn't #1 on the list, you know, of places that had
Right.
butterflies. But
Right.
we do have them in our demonstration area,
But
which
there
is
is
kind of fun.
milkweed on site. I've seen it before. The picture that you actually put for the speaker series is me next to the milkweed on the Yolo bypass.
Nice, nice. And we also used a couple of photos from one of our volunteers that were taken right out here at the benches where the kids come when they do their Discover the Flyway project. So,
oh, that's awesome.
yeah, so we do get them, just not quite where you were hoping. Anyway, we have had some questions that have come into the chat here, so
wow.
I want to read them off to you.
Sure.
And the first one that came in was, what are the predators of the monarch butterfly?
Anything that would eat insects. everything and anything that eats insects. Frogs, birds, like I said, anything that would eat them.
We so often hear that they taste bad. Any thoughts on that?
So if you try to eat the caterpillar, they do have those toxins from the milkweed, the cardinaloids, and those can be pretty yucky. And I've never tasted a monarch, so I'm not quite sure how they would taste, but I don't imagine they would taste super great.
Very good. Next question is, do the seeds need preparation before broadcasting?
Yes. So at our Heritage Growers, we do have a seed cleaner. So seeds do need to be cleaned and processed before we can go ahead and broadcast seed them.
Is there something that we as individuals would need to do if we were to try to plant seeds in our yards?
If you buy seeds, like I said, buy them from your local nursery, they will already be processed and cleaned and ready to plant.
Great. Very good. How far east and north do the coastal monarchs migrate?
So migrating, the western population will go all the way up as far as Canada, and then they'll go as far down south for their overwintering sites, as far down south as San Diego. And then the eastern population also can go all the way up to Canada, but they overwinter in Mexico.
It's a long way for a little tiny animal.
I know, that's why it's super important to have all these rich nectar sources for them to help them on that journey. It's a long journey.
It's a long journey. Were the adults in 2023 just passing through on their migration? What time of year were they observed?
So the Xerces Society did pollinator sampling May through September. So by that time, they were not really heading towards their migration yet. They were just more in their breeding and, eating phase.
Which species of milkweed is most desirable?
That is a great question. We want to know that too. I think that would be a great question for someone who wants to go to graduate school or for other researchers. I would love to know what species of milkweed do monarchs prefer here in the north or here in the south. Like I said, there are 15 different species here in California. But that would be a huge question to tackle, but I think it would be really, really critically important for future monarch conservation.
We have a question here from a person from the San Francisco Bay Area. on the bay side. And they say, I've planted narrow leaf milkweed and I give them very little extra water, none this year. Do you see any of the orange aphids on the milkweeds?
Yes. Actually, this summer I went to our Dos Rios Ranch to do a census of our plants there and to do releves. And when I was counting the stems and just observing the milkweed, I saw thousands of these little orange aphids on the milkweed, thousands of them.
What do you suggest for winter flowering nectar plants for overwintering monarchs?
So the overwintering monarchs make their way down to the Pacific coast. There, they just kind of hang out amongst the eucalyptus and the pines and the cypresses. So if you want to plant, really good nectar plants, you would want to find species that bloom early spring to early summer, and then some into late summer and early fall. So some good examples of the early flowering plants are like lupins and goldfields. And a good example of later blooming plants are mugwort and western goldenrod.
What is the commitment to fund future projects by the organization?
Well, we were funded by the Wildlife Conservation Board, and the funding has run out. This was a 3-year experiment, but that's not to say that we have a huge option if we wanted to redo this, but it would take probably a larger effort. I don't work on the funding side of River Partners. So that would be a really great question for someone who does work on our development team and our funding team. If you go to the River Partners website and you go to staff, you can find Helen Swaggerty. She is our director of development. Those would be some really great questions they could address to her. At this time, I don't really know.
Fair enough. We have another one of our Bay Area guests here. It said, don't plant milkweed within 5 miles of the ocean. Does San Francisco Bay count? I live in Richmond. It is probably 5 miles from Point Pinole, which is an overwintering site.
I don't know the answer to that, actually. I've never actually heard of don't plant milkweed within 5 miles of the ocean. But that could make sense, as they use just that Pacific coastline as their overwintering sites. They may not want to breed close to their overwintering sites. They want to go more inward and more north for their breeding sites. That would be my best guess. But as far as living in Richmond, I personally don't see why that would be an issue. If you've seen monarchs around your area, I think it would be really important to plant milkweed or any other nectar-rich species.
Same person, follow up here, says, I never quite understood the 5-mile limitation for overwintering sites. Our native narrow leaf milkweed is dormant in the winter, and if they are still in leave in October, can you cut them back to emulate dormancy?
I don't see why you couldn't. Since milkweed is dormant here in the winter, it is evolved to be like that. If you do cut it back enough, I'm sure that would replicate dormancy. I also never understood the 5-mile limitation for the overwintering sites. But my advice is to just plant milkweed anyways.
So kind of along that way, this is one of our local guests. I grew narrow leaf milkweed last summer. I have lots of seeds. how can I prepare them?
Then they should be ready to go. If you grew them, I don't think they need any additional processing. I think what I meant by that is if you go out and wildland collect seed, you would want to have that processed and cleaned. I am not super familiar with how they do that process. I've seen it. I've seen the facility at Heritage Growers, and it is a huge, crazy machine that they put seed in to clean. But if you already have milkweed seeds that are good and ready to go, you should go ahead and start planting them. The best time I think to plant species is in the fall, and it gives them a chance to kind of establish and get some rain before it germinates, and then we'll start blooming whenever it wants to bloom.
Should we avoid the swamp milkweed, which has been the only variety at Green Acres for the past 2 years?
That is a really good question. I am not actually sure if swamp weed is native to California. The important thing is to have milkweed that is not only native to California, but also native to your area. So you wouldn't want to plant desert milkweed, for example, here in Sacramento. It's just the desert milkweed has evolved to really survive in those hotter conditions than we have out here. It's a little more wet than in the desert. So the swamp milkweed that's at Green Acres, I'm not sure. You could maybe check to see where it's being sourced at. And if it's anywhere not close to your region, I would probably try to avoid it. Species like narrowleaf milkweed and showy milkweed are found pretty much statewide. I'd say those are usually safer bets to have.
One of our guests commented back about the question about preparing the seeds. And they said, I have harvested a lot of narrow leaf milkweed seeds, and the only thing I do is take the silk tassels off and make sure they are stored in a cool, dry place, and then start them in small pots in the spring. So that kind of goes with what you were saying about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So we store a lot of our seeds actually in a refrigerator at our Dos Rios site. In the field trailer there, you open the door and there's like one jar of peanut butter and then just like so many bags of seeds. So yeah, the best way is to keep them nice and cool.
And then same person commenting, I don't see swamp milkweed listed on the CalScape. So
right.
Sounds like it's not native here.
Yeah, so I'd maybe avoid planting that one, unfortunately. Oh yeah, I'm seeing the next question about not planting milkweed. It might disrupt their migration.
Yeah, go ahead and go. You can see it. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, yeah. I just wanted to say that's a great point. And thank you for sharing that, Lynn.
You want to go ahead and read out the question that people in the video won't be able to hear it. I mean, the people in the recording won't be able to see the question.
Oh, okay. So this question says, I grew showy milkweed the last 3 years and have some seeds now. What's a good way to share them? You can share them with whoever you want. You could just put them in a little Ziploc and hand them to someone, and then have them put them in their fridge. What I also like to do is I like to take a bunch of seeds and walk around my neighborhood and just throw them around. It's called guerrilla gardening, I think. Really fun.
Next one up says, I have a small urban garden in Sacramento. How large a patch of milkweed would I need to plant to be beneficial to the monarchs?
That's another really good question. I think that would need some more research done to it. I'm not quite sure how many is needed for monarchs to really have a preference. But I'd say if you have at least one milkweed, that would be a pretty good start. I would try to have like a pretty you don't have to have a super huge plot, but you can have, if you have some seeds and you'd like to just throw them in a pot and see how it goes, I think that would be pretty good.
And that sort of follows with the comment that one of our guests made in reply, which was you don't have to grow a very big patch. I grew a few at first and had caterpillars the first year. I guess one thing is that you might get more caterpillars than you have milkweed.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and that is super exciting that you had even a small patch of milkweed have some caterpillars on there.
Yeah, excellent.
Did you get to observe them at all different life stages? Well, of the caterpillar, the 5 instars. It's really interesting to see that they can be.
The comment back was planted and they will come. Yes, I observed at all stages.
That's so awesome. I love to hear that, Robin.
Well, thank you. Oh,
Yeah,
wait, got one more just came
sure.
in. How about making seed bombs, seed rolled in kids' clay and thrown out your car window during the winter?
I've never heard of rolling them in clay before. Seed bombing, I just put a bunch of them in my palm and I just like throw them out the window. So, but yeah, if you've read somewhere where they can be put in clay and then you can throw it out the window, then yeah, I don't
Give it a
see why
shot.
that wouldn't work. But maybe use like soil clay and maybe not like the air dry clay that you use for like arts and crafts might not be as biodegradable as soil.
We got some great clay around here in Davis.
Right.
Yeah, seed bombs are a great way of guerrilla gardening.
Oh yeah. So the seed bombs keep the birds away. So if they're rolled up in a little soil clay and you throw them out the window, perfect.
Excellent. Oh, can I grow milkweed in a pot?
Yep.
Well, that was an easy one.
Yeah. I wouldn't plant a lot of them in a pot. But if you get one of those really big planters, you could probably put more seeds in there. What I've noticed in milkweed is that they kind of like all bundle together really closely. And it's kind of hard actually to count all of the stems when there's just like a huge clump of them. You kind of get them all mixed up.
Back to the natural bridges question. Why does planting disrupt migration at natural bridges?
I don't see that question.
You replied to it. It was one of the ones that you noticed right away. Here it is. At Natural Bridges State Park, a site for monarchs in Santa Cruz County, the sign says
yeah.
not to plant milkweed in the area. Milkweed may disrupt the migration.
Well, so the adults use the milkweeds to lay their eggs. So if it's too close to their overwintering site, they might get a little confused on their migration. So I think that the monarchs like to go a little more inland to start breeding instead of having it super close to their overwintering sites. That is my best guess at it.
Okay. And some compliments here. A couple more comments about the overwintering. Do the overwintering monarchs eat?
I think that, let me go back to my little PowerPoint. Because I don't think that they do. But I could be totally wrong, so do not count me on that.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Yeah,
I do want to bring my screen back up and just remind you next month, we are going to be hearing from our fellowship recipients, the graduate students that we're working on various environmental issues that impact our area. a little bit about mosquitoes. And one of the students is helping us to determine a better way to evaluate our effectiveness for our Discover the Flyway program. For those of you who were around last year, Stephen did the beginning of his pond turtle and giant garter snake talk. He's going to tell us more about his results. And then finally, we will be hearing about salmon. So pretty exciting to see what these individuals and their research brings. So I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We hope we see you next month. YoloBasin.org, look up Flyway Nights, and you can see our list of events for the rest of this year. Thank you for being with us, Halie. Appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me. And like I said, if you have any questions that I wasn't able to answer or you think of later, my email is hgoeman@riverpartners.org. And thanks again, everyone.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Good night, everyone.